Okay, now we are going to be talking about a topic of boundaries. And if you're unfamiliar with boundaries, that's okay, because 12 years ago I had no idea what boundaries were at all. And nobody I even knew talked about boundaries, but it is actually a really important topic when it comes to dating and actually all relationships. Well, I learned about boundaries reading a book called Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend 12 years ago. And that really helped me a lot in sorting through a lot of the difficult things in relationships. So I want to talk to you first about what a boundary is. When you think about a boundary, when you have physical property, you have a fence around it maybe that indicates what's your land and your property and what, where the line is that marks where your land stops and somebody else's begins. So fences are really easy to understand as far as physical boundaries go. Well, boundaries, when it comes to us and our relationships, have to do with what is ours, what belongs to us, and what belongs to somebody else, including things like our feelings, our body, our time, our thoughts, our values, our actions, and our choices. Now, sometimes I don't know, it seems like maybe that should be obvious as to what belongs to us and what belongs to somebody else, but not always. But it's not always as obvious as it might seem, because a lot of the challenges and a lot of the difficulties in relationships come from it being blurry about what's your responsibility or what's somebody else's responsibility in the relationship. Just in the matter of feelings, for instance, when we think about our feelings and our emotions, have you ever heard people say something like, you made me feel a certain way, or somebody saying you shouldn't feel that way, where somehow you were told that you shouldn't have the feelings that you have, or that somebody else maybe caused the feelings that you have. Well, this is an area where it indicates that there's some blurriness about what's your responsibility and what's somebody else's, because when you think about what emotions are, we talked about that whole topic of guarding your heart before. Emotions, there's no right or wrong when it comes to emotion, which might surprise you. But emotions just are. They are more indicators of what's going on with you. They are an involuntary reaction, actually, to something that's happening inside. So they're actually great for letting you know that you're responding to something. But you can't judge emotions. So it's not going to work if you think you shouldn't feel a certain way. And nobody can make you feel a certain way. You can feel a certain way that is a reaction to what somebody else is doing, but that's different than actually them controlling your feelings or emotions. And maybe it'll make sense as we talk a little bit more about this in some of the other categories of feelings. Another one that comes up as far as your what belongs to you is your body. Now you wouldn't think that would ever be in question, as far as that your body's your body and that you have control to make the decisions and choices that you want about your body. But sometimes in dating in particular, that actually can be blurry. I had a friend of mine once that was in a relationship with somebody, and she was committed to abstinence, and she was dating somebody that wasn't committed to abstinence. And there was actually some confusion about feeling like if she said no, that she didn't want to have sex, that she was somehow, that wasn't her choice to make, because she thought she was imposing on somebody else. So you see, there's an area where could be some lack of clarity about the fact that no, if your body is your body, you get to do with it what you want, and they get to choose what they do with their body, so long as it's not involving your body when you don't want it to. So there's where everybody's body gets to choose what they want to do, and so you choosing about your body is not making somebody else, forcing them into a choice. When it comes to your time, your time is your time, and have you ever felt guilty about how you spent your time, or maybe where you've overcommitted because you felt really bad, you felt like bad to have time for yourself, or felt obligated as far as spending time with people? And so if you've ever run into having a lifestyle where where you were driving yourself crazy, you couldn't squeeze all the things in because you were overcommitting to things, out of a place of feeling guilty or feeling like you had obligation. That's an indicator of not being clear about your time being your time, and you get to make the choices, and they are your choices to make. You get to make choices whether you know, there are no you should be doing this. A lot of this with boundaries, we need to get rid of the idea of we're doing it because we should, you know, where we're doing things from that place rather than really owning the decisions and choices that we're making. Like, we're going to make bad decisions. I'm going to make bad decisions, but they're ours to make. So there's a difference between saying, you know, like you should do something versus the saying, you know, I did this, whether it's right or wrong, I'm choosing to do it, where you're making a deliberate choice that's based out of what you're deciding to do and not out of guilt and not out of fear and not out of a sense of obligation. Have you ever heard that old saying, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still? Well, your thoughts are your thoughts, and nobody can make you think a certain way. Now, that's a little bit different than being persuaded. Persuaded, you know, happens all the time, and that can be a good thing, but that means nobody's trying to push their ideas or their thoughts on you. How about values? Values are a really important thing to be clear about, and as Patty taught in her teaching, you know, when she was talking about how, you know, she was blurring her values for another person, where her values began to disappear into, you know, her relationship with somebody else. So that's another area why it's really important before you get into especially romantic relationship, to be clear and to own your values, that they are your values, you know. And actions. You know, have you ever heard somebody say something like, you made me do that? There is nobody can make you do something, you know. So whatever you are doing, you made me hit you? Oh, sure, yeah. I wouldn't listen to that one. So, but, you know, it's like your behaviors are your behaviors. If you're doing them, nobody made you do them. It's your decision and choice to take those actions. Same thing with we've been talking all about this as far as your choices. And again, you want to own your choices from a place of doing that, because you're deciding to, that it's a deliberate choice. Now, it's kind of interesting because there's a difference between, this brings up the point, between choosing to do something, like doing something because you want something or doing something because you feel like it. There's a lot of, because sometimes people will take this and do whatever they feel like doing, which is your choice to do. But that's actually different than what you actually want to do. Something you might want to do something, like I might want to lose weight, you know, but I might feel like having a donut, which is counter to my wanting to lose weight, you know. So at certain points, there are things that we want that are going to mean that we're going to have to do things we don't feel like doing. Does that make sense? Because sometimes people get in the trap when they get on this kind of kick of I'm going to make my own decisions, I'm going to make my own choices, where then it leads into a pattern of I just follow what I feel like doing, which, like I say, you can do that, but it can be counter in your decisions to the things that you really want in the bigger picture. Because there's things that you might want, you know, that'll take doing what you don't feel like doing to get there. So that's just important to clarify that point right there. Okay. Now, where does this come in as far as controlling people? You know, a lot of us have experienced or maybe been controlling people, and that actually, strangely, we all have some controlling qualities in us. It's kind of interesting in all of these categories when we're looking at our growth to keep understanding that we're looking at growth as a continuum. There's no like I've arrived. I'm never controlling. That doesn't live inside of me. But let's talk about all those other controlling people, huh? So, but we, you know what I'm talking about when you say like, what about controlling people? What happens with that? What's interesting, because there are people that try to control, meaning they try to impose their wishes and their desires on you in spite of your wishes, desires, and choices. That they will make attempts by doing things like manipulating, by using guilt things. You know, well, it's the least you could do for me because I've done this for you. You know what I'm saying? People that try and make you feel bad, or people that try and manipulate you, or people that try and dominate you, or threaten you, or, you know, intimidate you. into doing something that they want that you don't want to do. Now, it's interesting because there are people that attempt to control, but whether you're controlled or not is still your choice. So this is where we really need to be clear about boundaries, because sometimes people think that boundaries are putting limits on other people. Like, I put a boundary on that person and they didn't listen. What am I going to do? I put the boundary, but they're not listening. Boundaries, we need to be very clear about that, but boundary is a limit you're putting on yourself. A limit of what you are going to be okay with or not okay with. What are you going to tolerate or not tolerate? Because you can't make somebody else do something. You can just decide, what you'll put up with or not put up with, and what you'll do if somebody, continues on a certain course. And we're going to talk about that too as we go more specifically, and on how to have those conversations and things like that. In this, it's that your choices are made with the understanding of free will, and in this, that we want to honor each other's choices and free will. That it talks about in, I want to go to this verse, which in 1 John 4. In verse 18, it says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love." So what we want to be is we want to make decisions definitely not based out of fear. That our decisions or choices, that's not what's motivating us in the things that we're choosing to do. And another thing is that when there really is love in a relationship, real love, that's safe, that it talks about in 1 Corinthians 13, you're not going to be experiencing fear. The fear ultimately, sometimes we'll bring in fear from other relationships, but ultimately when we're in safe relationships where real love exists, when there's not manipulation and there's not, trying to control or dominate, then, in those relationships the fear goes away. We start letting go of fear, and experience real love. And actually I want to go to Galatians too. Galatians 6. And in verse 2, it says, "Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Each one should test his own actions, then he can pride himself without comparing himself to somebody else, for each one should carry his own load." So this is actually a really good verse of scripture. That it's kind of interesting because in verse 2 it talks about that we should carry each other's burdens. We get the idea that we should be there for one another, that we want to be there to help. And I think that that's innately in all of us, that we have the desire to want to help others and to want to be there and want to be supportive. And that's a godly thing to do, But it also says in verse 5 that for each one of us should carry his own load. So what we see is that there's a difference between, this is a really good indicator of the difference in responsibility, where each one of us have responsibility that's ours and ours alone. That there are things that we clearly, it's on us. It's on us to choose. It's on us to take responsibility for our actions. And then we also see that there's a part where we can be there for one another. So the idea is learning to, how can you be there for somebody without crossing over the line? Do you know what I'm saying? Without, how can you support somebody but still allow them to take responsibility for the things that are truly their responsibility and not be responsible for too much? We want to not be too responsible for too much and not be responsible for too little. And that's kind of the overall picture that we're talking about as far as boundaries go. It's easier to set boundaries when you're well defined. And that's what Patty's teaching was really great. There was a lot that she brought up when she was talking about knowing who you are before you date, and why that's important to grow to a place in platonic relationships before dating that you can be clearer about where you end and other people begin. that you can know what your desires and thoughts and interests and everything are, before dating. Otherwise, what happens is, like what Patty talked about, is you try and change for the other person. Now, what happens, let's look at a couple of the things that happen when you are taking too much responsibility for somebody else's feelings, when you're crossing into that. Anybody here can relate to being a people pleaser? What that is if you care too much about what people think and you're worrying a lot and trying to make decisions and choices. I'm sure that's never happened to you. Everybody's experienced that, haven't they? Where we're so worried about how somebody's going to feel about us that we make our decisions and choices that we don't really want to make, for the other person. Another one is that's really common. These are all kind of examples of having some boundary problems, some issues on being, unclear as far as boundary things. Codependence, you might have heard of codependence. And that comes up, again, that's actually specifically where you're not clear at all, where you're making yourself responsible for somebody else and taking too much care and too much responsibility for another person. And that often comes up when there has been some breakdowns in family relationships. A lot of times when we've been kids, when things have happened like alcoholic families, you see a lot of codependent behaviors. I came from an alcoholic family, so there was a lot in me that was built from a really young age of thinking that I could help my parents. Like I actually grew up specifically thinking that I wanted to rescue my mom. So just as a little kid, I had all these feelings and, about, if I could just help her, like I could, if I could just do enough. Or sometimes people that just have divorced parents. Divorce can actually be, today we don't think divorce is that big of a deal because it's so common, but it really is traumatic. It's totally was never God's design that parents would, get divorced. I mean, it didn't used to happen. This was not commonplace. God really designed the family that people would stay together and that children would get the nurture and love of both parents there. But today, divorce is nothing, so we act like it shouldn't be traumatic. But yet it really does affect people, because how many times do kids somehow feel like caught between their two parents, or caught in the crossfire of the two parents, or thinking that it's their fault as far as the divorce, or if they could have done something different, and so many of us have had feelings growing up where from just a very early age, we thought we were responsible for things that we weren't really responsible for. And so we get ourselves into relationships where we take on that responsibility. I mean, when I married my ex-husband, the relationship had a lot to do with me trying to sit there and be there for him, and he was an alcoholic. And so I kept thinking, if I love him enough, that was the Christian. I came from a Christian perspective of, if I love him enough, if I just give him enough love, then, it'll all be good, And sometimes with that, we define ourselves by how much we're needed in the relationship, that we feel like that's who we are, and that's where we get our self-worth, is that we feel like that other person needs us. And so that's also where we fall into those patterns. Another category is enabling. Enabling is allowing bad behavior. So what it is that God set up the law of sowing and reaping in life. Sowing and reaping is like where, if you look at things, is that basically whatever we do, the world is sort of set up that we get good things for what we do, or that there are consequences for not so good things that we do, that we get rewards and benefits for certain things, and that other things cost us. Does that make sense? Where there's sowing and reaping, that you get what you sow, you get what you put out there. Well, what happens is if you're in a relationship that you're interrupting that, where somebody's not having to pay the consequences of their behavior, that you're bailing them out all the time. It's called enabling. And because actually from my family history, I actually did gang ministry for a number of years, which was like an amazing experience for my life. I did that for over 10 years. but there were so many things that I didn't understand. I came out from the family system that I came out from, and so I just poured the love on these kids, and they were amazing, and it was a great experience for me. But there were so many things that I knew that they didn't grow as much as they could have grown because I did a lot of enabling. Like, there were a lot of things that they did, and I kind of thought it was really Christian, just give them love, give them love. If I give them enough love, it's all going to work out. Well, the reality is, as much as that was an amazing experience, I don't believe that there was as much good results or good fruit from that experience as there could have been if I had been more aware of boundaries at the time, which I totally was not. So because I did enabling there, where I bailed them out for their bad behavior instead of allowing them to have consequences for the things that they did. So that's, taking too much responsibility for somebody else. Like, I took it on me, like I could do it all as far as helping them goes. Maybe some of you can relate to that. Like, you just care, it's normal. Like, you want to care about people. But sometimes these are patterns where, we're going too far. Another thing that kind of relates to having a hard time setting boundaries is passive aggressive behavior. And what that would be is like where you want something, but instead of speaking up about it, you do things like maybe you withdraw or you shut down, you retreat. And supposedly, I've done this, probably you have too. I think actually, you know what, on all of these things, we've all done them. The Bible says there's none righteous, no, not one. So no matter what we're talking about here, what's kind of, cool in a way, is if you can look at that and see where this lives in yourself, because the Bible talks about we want to take the telephone pole out of our eye before we're trying to take the speck out of somebody else's. So in all of these, when we look at them, we also want to see the parts that this lives in us and not just, oh yeah, I know somebody just like that. So anyway, but passive aggressive is where we do behaviors that aren't speaking up about what we don't like, or, instead we do things like retreat or punish somebody, hoping that they'll get the lesson, oh, I'll teach them, I'm gonna retreat. I'll teach them, I'm going to shut down and not care. I've had a lot of those. My place that I go is I'll show you, I'm not going to care. So I learned to be really good at that one. But I'm moving through it. I'm committed to opening my heart more and speaking up about the things that I don't like instead of trying to punish somebody by my withdrawal. And I think sometimes this comes up because we feel weak to make requests. Has that ever been a problem? Do you know what I'm saying? Where it feels too vulnerable and it's kind of scary to ask somebody for something, because there's a sense that feels like, well, what if they say no? Or somehow where you think that you're giving up your personal power to do that, or you're seeming needy, And so sometimes instead of expressing what we really need, the fears there are that we'll be considered to be needy, or we're afraid of rejection. What if they say no? But part of all of these things that we're talking about is taking too much responsibility for somebody else, but also, if you think about it, it's making somebody else responsible for your well-being. You're painting yourself in a little corner where you cannot be happy unless somebody else changes. Does that make sense? So do you see how that's not, does that make sense, but makes sense in the way that you wind up being stuck and powerless. Do you see? You totally paint yourself in a little corner and there's nothing you can do. You're stuck because your well-being is dependent upon somebody else doing something. So in boundary setting, it's owning your own decisions and choices and not, on the things that you get to choose and decide. So when we do this, when we make other people responsible, in all of these behaviors, a lot of times we wind up resenting somebody. Have you ever felt that way? Where you're sitting there resenting because somebody's not giving you what you want, or somebody's not doing, what you would like, or you're not getting what you want. Because you're making them responsible for your happiness. So it builds this inner kind of resentment stuff, which is ugly. I know we've all experienced resentment. Not a fun thing to experience when it's in there, because again, you're trapped. What are you going to do with that? You know, you just painted yourself into a corner of being powerless and being unhappy because of somebody else's decisions and choices. So what we're going to do in the next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about how do we pull out of that. You know, we've talked a little bit about in this segment about about boundaries and what they are, and taking the appropriate amount of responsibility, and what it looks like not to take responsibility or to take too much responsibility for somebody else. And so in the next segment, we're going to clarify some things as far as how can you take back that power? How can you take back the choices that are yours and have the freedom so that you don't have to sit there stuck in resentment, but that you can actually be in charge of being happy and being free. And we'll be talking about that in the next segment.
Girl I liked for years, and I asked her out one time on a date, and we went to Chili's as a restaurant, and it wasn't happening, and I was like, what's going on? Like, I've liked you forever, why isn't this working? And I just found myself wanting to give more and more of myself to make it work. Like, I wanted it to happen no matter what. And so, like, I had a really nice car in high school. I had like a 1988 Firebird Formula. You may have heard of it. It's a pretty amazing car. And I used to think that. And so for me, it was like the best thing I had. And I remember when we got done with the date, I was like, you want to drive? You want to drive home? And she's like, yeah, I'll drive. And so there I was, is like letting her drive my car home. And she dropped me off in my own car. And I got home and I was just like, idiot, stupid move. Like, I gave everything to her, like, kind of like a symbol. It was like a symbol of like the worst I could do right there. Like, total insecure guy, like, gets driven home by his date. And for me, I was just like, that's ridiculous. Like, I'm so embarrassed about that. So I realized, gosh, I'm probably needing to learn about how dating works a little more, because that's probably not it. And there's probably a lot of deeper stuff there. Like, I probably wasn't very confident in who I was. I probably didn't have a sense of my own value and worth.
You know, at a very early age, around 4 or 5, my parents were going through a divorce, and this was something I felt responsible for, just because I was around. And ultimately, I ended up, living with my mom in a single-family environment, or single-parent environment, rather. And it was difficult. It was very, very challenging in the sense that what I found was it was better for me to worry about everybody else and take care of everyone else's emotional needs instead of my own. There was lots of drama, a lot of immaturity in certain areas in the family, and we were poor, and there was a lot of stress, and pretty stressful. So, in that, I developed a sense that I didn't have room. There was no room for me to have needs, to express emotions.
We got an apartment, lived together. There were times where, like, I had to get 2 jobs to make that apartment payment, to make the house, the apartment payment, to pay my bills, to pay her bills. And she would have a part-time job, but it's pretty sad because I would have to get 2 jobs, like 2 8-hour jobs. And I did it for like 3 years just to keep her happy. And for me, it was okay for to work all these extra hours, all these jobs that I had, because I wanted her to have. I thought that money and buying her things would pretty much help the relationship. Like, that's gonna fix the relationship, and it didn't.
Having lost my virginity at 12, 13, it was a ways. It's like 10 years later or whatever. Being abstinent for a few months was a big deal for me. So I told this guy that I had worked with, and I told him that I wasn't gonna have sex. And this was all new for me. And so I went over to his house, we hung out, and it was fine. And then hung out again. And after a few times of hanging out, then he pressured me into having sex, even though I said this is not what I wanted to do. And I'm like, no, I don't want to. And then, I again felt pressured to have sex with a guy, and those feelings it's like, be- you know, at that time, I just didn't know that I can really say no to a guy and that would be okay, or that I would still be attractive to a guy without having sex with him. And so anyways, we ended up having sex, and I felt extremely horrible. I was like, gosh, you know, I wanted to be sexually pure, and I didn't want to feel used anymore. I didn't want to feel like somebody was just using me for my body, and I felt like he robbed me from that. Like, I felt like I was losing my virginity all over again.
Then I got into one relationship, which I'm still trying to get over. I dated him for 2.5 years, and it just didn't work out. But then I've been messing with him for 5 years, and I was more like I was the other woman for 5 years, and I never knew and realized what I was doing. I just wanted him to love me. I just wanted him to be with me. I wanted him to just show me that he cared, and so I took the time, and I just thought it was fine. As long as I had him, I didn't care, you know, let him be with somebody else, and you know, and I wasn't gonna mind as long as he was giving me some type of attention and some type of love. I was gonna take it.
Like I say, I grew up without my mom and my dad, and you know, my mom wasn't there to give me love. My dad wasn't there to give me love. You know, the only love that I got was from her. So it was just really, really unhealthy. You know, fighting all the time. Of her throwing glasses at me in my face, and it was just so unhealthy. But you know what? It was comfort. I felt comfortable. You know, we would have crazy fights, but then after that, we would make up on the fights. We'll make up and we just get back together. And for that, it was like that for 12 years, back and forth, back and forth. We didn't have nothing in common. You know, like, it was just feeling comfortable next to her.
In that relationship, though, it got physical. Every time I would drink, he would say, "You're an alcoholic." And one time, after I had been drinking, we got into this huge argument at my friend's house, and he ended up chipping my tooth out because I think he chipped my tooth with a ring that he had on. Like, he hit me in my face, and these are things I thought before I would never have put up with, but I put up with them anyways. When we first got together, like, it felt like this guy was my savior, where he saved the day, where he was the knight in shining armor that saved me, and he continued to save me in our relationship, which I realized later on. When I would argue with my parents, I'd call him, he'd pick me up. If my friends flaked on me, he'd come and pick me up. You know, when I didn't have any friends, I hung out with him and his friends, and you know, it was like I made him my life, and I looked to him to fill all of my needs that needed to be filled in by, and a lot of that needed to be filled in by my dad and my mom, and they just weren't there, and so I looked to him to get those needs met.
So when we're driving back to San Diego, you know, I told him, like, hey, you know, how about we work it out? You know, what's going on? You know, like, where are we at this point? And at that time, she was seeing somebody, but she didn't want to tell me because her phone was going off the hook, like, bling, bling, you know, and on the road, and I was like, oh man, like, and I had to, like, I was accepting that, you know, in my mind I was thinking, like, you know what, this girl's talking to somebody, but for me it was just okay, you know, it was just like, I'm here with her, driving to San Diego with her, it's okay. So I had that feeling that, you know, that she was, you know, talking to somebody, and I had a feeling that somebody was gonna spend the night there with her that night. So I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna take a drive by her house. And so I take a drive by her house, and there's this strange car that I've never seen before, you know, and I'm like knocking, knocking in her window. She wouldn't open her window, you know, as before. If she didn't have nobody in there, like, she would open, she would have looked outside. She never looked. So I was so pissed. I was like so angry, so like I just couldn't take it. Like I went psycho. So I was like slamming on the front door, and like finally her friends opened the door. Mikey, what are you doing? I'm like, where's Jennifer? And they're like, she's in her room, and she comes out, right? She comes out, and she's like, what's wrong? What's going on? And she's like, I'm like, who in the F is in this house? Like, who are you with in the room? And stuff. And she's like, nobody. Like, I'm like, so I had a knife, like, to cut boxes, because that's what I used to use to cut boxes, for Budweiser. And so I told him, like, whose vehicle is that right there in the front? And she's like, I don't know. I'm like, all right, if you don't know, I'm gonna slice those tires and like scratch the paint. And so she was just like too afraid to tell me that somebody was in there. So what I did is I slashed all 4 tires of that vehicle, and I scratched the paint. And then her friend was talking smack to me and telling me, oh, you freaking ass, and blah blah blah, like, what are you doing coming to this house, disrespectful. And I told her friend, I'm like, you know what, you shut the F up, it's none of your business. I'm like, you better shut up before I slice your tires. So I started slicing her friend's tires, like all 4 tires, and scratched her car right in front of her. I was like, oh my God, like, what am I doing? Like, and man, they were calling me off the hook through the whole day, Like, there's a detective, he's taking fingerprints, you better pay for this, you better pay for that. And I was afraid that I was gonna lose my job, And I was like driving to the yard and like, oh man, these cops are gonna be here waiting for me. And so I finally talked to her, and I told her, I'm like, you know what, I just blew up, I was hurt for what you did. You hurt me really bad. You should have just told me from the beginning. You should have told me, like, hey, I'm not willing to work it out, but no, you had to play those games where, like, you wanted to be with this guy and then be with me, have me on the side. And so things like that, it was just like unhealthy and miserable. And after I did that, I ended up paying for the guy's tires, his paint job, and her friend's tires and her paint job. So man, it was like $2,000 that I had to pay, and that was from having an unhealthy relationship.